Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in New Jersey. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1912. The town of Montclair, quiet and respectable, still whispered of the influenza seasons that swept through its narrow streets and left families dressing parlors in mourning black. It was here, in a two-story boarding house owned by the Wetherell family, that 23-year-old Clara Litton prepared for her wedding. She was, by every account, a gentle woman, careful with her words, fond of lacework, and always turning down the lamps earlier than others in the house said was proper. Her fiancé, a clerk named Daniel Price, worked for a medical supply company in Newark, a connection that years later would trouble investigators who reopened the file following reports of unusual embalming practices. Clara's final days were documented in a series of disjointed letters preserved by her younger sister, Mary Ellen. Letters that shifted from joy to illness with unsettling speed. In one, dated May 3rd, she writes, "Daniel brought me roses today. I think he fears for my nerves more than I do." By the 10th, the handwriting trembles, and she notes a bitter taste that lingers even after bread or broth. A local physician, Dr. Horace Eldon, diagnosed her with what he called exhaustive hysteria, a term used broadly at the time to describe nearly any ailment of women who worked, wept, or worried too long. Clara was prescribed rest and laudanum. Within days, she was barely conscious. Montclair's small mortuary operated by the Davenports recorded her death on the evening of May 15th. The undertaker's apprentice, a young man named Lewis Harding, later testified that he had been told the girl passed gently, without sound. She was dressed in her bridal gown, a custom at her mother's insistence, and placed in a family vault on the northern ridge of Greenwood Cemetery. That would have been the end, had it not been for a night watchman's report 6 days later. He wrote that he heard a tapping or rattling sound, irregular, faint, from the Litton enclosure. The constable dismissed it as settling of earth or wind through the gate, and the matter was dropped. The file might have remained forgotten, but in 1919, when workmen expanded the cemetery boundary, one of them, a former Dial painter who had heard of the strange sicknesses spreading through Newark's radium, factories insisted on reopening certain sealed crypts. He mentioned that his cousin had worked among the radium girls, whose bones glowed faintly in the dark from years of exposure to luminous paint. His account drew curious journalists, and by the time the vault was opened, the smell of lime and decay mixed with something far stranger. The coffin lid cracked from within. Clara's remains lay twisted, arms bent upward, fingertips bruised, against the silk interior. The attending coroner called it a case of premature burial, brought on by misdiagnosed catalepsy. But the church records do not list any correction or retraction. The official ledger still reads natural causes. Those who lived near the cemetery recalled in later interviews the sound of metal tools at midnight as the gravediggers worked silently, returning her to the earth. In the years that followed, the Wetherell boarding house changed owners twice and quietly fell into disrepair. The Litton family left Montclair soon after Clara's exhumation, claiming they could not endure the gossip that settled like soot across their street. The official cause of death, cataleptic seizure, became a kind of whispered shorthand among local physicians for cases that made no sense. One of Dr. Eldon's surviving notes from 1912, preserved in the Essex County Archives, mentions a rigidity unbroken by stimulus, though the pupils remained faintly reactive. It was written in hurried script beside an order for additional laudanum and morphine. Clara's mother, Margaret, had refused the autopsy at the time of burial, fearing mutilation of the body. Mary Ellen, in a later affidavit, claimed that her mother heard faint movements within the house the night after the funeral, a sound like fingernails along the walls. Such testimonies were quietly excluded from public records, though a carbon copy of the statement appears in a stack of forgotten correspondence now kept at the Montclair Historical Society investigators. Decades later would compare Clara's symptoms with cases from the radium girls and other factory workers poisoned. slowly by luminous dust her fiancé. Daniel's connection to a Newark supply company, dealing with radium dial instruments, drew suspicion, though no direct link was ever proven. By 1920, Daniel had vanished entirely from the census, last recorded purchasing a one-way train ticket to Pittsburgh under the name Harold Dean. The mortuary apprentice, Lewis Harding, was later questioned again after inconsistencies were found in his logbook. He admitted that, on the night of Clara's supposed death, he had been alone for several hours with the body, applying a preservative compound sent by Daniel himself. It had a faint shine, he said, like light through milk. When asked why he hadn't reported the tapping heard days later, Harding grew pale. "Because I thought she might still be," he paused. 1. The official inquiry ended without charge. The coroner, Samuel Rains, wrote only, "No conclusive evidence of malicious act. The girl may have been in trance, revived too late." Local rumor persisted nonetheless, especially among the night staff at Greenwood, who claimed that frost never formed evenly on her section of the vault. Even in the coldest months, a thin melt pattern ran from the stone outward, like the shape of a sleeping figure. Some nights, caretakers swore they heard the latch move gently, as if breathing continued beneath the marble slabs. Every few years, new workers petitioned for transfers away from the North Ridge, describing uneasy silences and tools misplaced by morning. The cemetery registry contains dozens of unsigned complaints, all tied to that plot, stretching until at least 1934. By 1921, the case had shifted from tragedy to quiet superstition. Local newspapers referred to it obliquely as the Bride's Rest, printing small columns beside church notices and railway schedules. Nothing sensational, just short lines noting that visitors report odd warmth near plot. 47B, a young reporter from the Montclair Register named Edwin Hollis began piecing together what remained of the records. He described the Lytton affair as a symptom of a wider negligence among provincial physicians, citing the work of early toxicologists studying cases similar to the radium girls in Newark and Orange. He wrote that both sets of victims showed paleness, fatigue, and an unearthly glow about the mouth and fingertips, though his editor struck that last phrase before print. Hollis spent the winter visiting attics, rectories, and infirmaries, searching for any trace of Daniel Price. No one could confirm his death or survival. A forged marriage license bearing his handwriting surfaced in Trenton but was dismissed as curiosity. In March 1922, a blizzard struck northern New Jersey, and the roof of the Wetherill boarding house collapsed, exposing a hidden crawl space between floors. There, according to the inspection notes, workers found a leather-bound notebook stamped with the initials DP. The pages described experiments with embalming, mixtures containing powdered luminescent salts, likely radium sulfate, intended to preserve tissue without odor. One entry read simply, "If breath returns before rigor, one might appear still." Historians later debated whether Daniel had tested these formulas on animals or people. The handwriting deteriorated toward the end, slanting wildly as if written by candlelight or shaking hands. The final line stated, "She moved once. After the discovery, Hollis disappeared from public record." His last letter, mailed to a colleague in Newark, mentioned hearing a faint voice near the northern ridge calling in intervals like breathing through water. It arrived 3 days after a cemetery worker named Clarence Vale reported finding footprints in freshly fallen snow leading from the Lytton vault to the church gate. No prints returning. The town council ordered the cemetery sealed at night, citing vandalism. But privately, several aldermen admitted fearing contagion or radiation. The memory of the glowing factory girls was still fresh. Clara's story became a boundary between science and legend. Physicians refused to discuss it, while locals left wildflowers by the gate each May without knowing exactly why. By the late 1920s, the ledger page containing her burial entry had faded, the ink nearly erased except for one faint remark penciled at the bottom margin. Re-examined, status uncertain. Throughout the 1930s, Greenwood Cemetery became a study, site for pathologists from Newark General Hospital who quietly requested soil samples from the northern ridge. They sought traces of luminescent residue, similar to what had been documented around the factories where the radium girls once worked. The samples showed faint ionization, insufficient for hazard, yet strong enough to cloud photographic plates left overnight. The supervising chemist, Dr. Jonas Keene, noted in his margin comments that the Lytton vault emits a measurable halo, origin undetermined. No formal paper was ever published. The cemetery caretaker, now an aging veteran named Vale, confessed to the rector that he no longer locked the church after dusk. He said the hinges resisted closing. As if air pushed outward, the parish minutes mentioned this only briefly, mechanical, difficulty with door latch, but local memory held it. Differently, children dared one another to touch the gate after midnight and claim they heard tapping from below. Among them was a teenage choir boy, Thomas Devereux, who in 1937 claimed to have seen a pale outline standing beside the open trench where repairs were underway. He told his mother it looked like a bride without flowers. Police dismissed it as imagination, though several workers admitted hearing a woman's sob in the fog that same week. Investigators reviewed the original mortuary entries once more and found discrepancies between the number of preservative vials ordered by Daniel Price and those returned unused. The pattern suggested a second treatment had been attempted days after burial, possibly an effort to retrieve or preserve the body privately. No record shows who authorized it. A typed memo from the Essex County Coroner's Office, dated March 1938, reads, "Files retained for administrative completeness. No exhumation warranted." Still, curiosity lingered among university students studying early forensic errors. One such student, Eleanor Bird, compiled a thesis comparing premature burial cases across New Jersey. Her paper cited the Lytton incident as the clearest example of pathological misreading of suspended animation. Guy visited the site in autumn 1939 and recorded that the earth above the vault was warmer than surrounding ground by a measurable degree. It felt, she wrote, as though breath remained beneath. Shortly after her submission, the historical wing of the county courthouse suffered a small electrical fire, destroying numerous health board documents, including the remainder of Dr. Eldon's correspondence. By 1940, mention of Clara vanished from public conversation, except among sextons, who claimed the grass on her ridge never browned even in drought. The story passed into folklore, told in lowered voices to newcomers renting rooms in Montclair's older quarter, a caution about mistakes physicians could never quite admit. In the years that followed the war, Montclair's new generation hardly remembered Clara by name, yet they recognized the ridge by its chill. The old boarding house where she once lived was finally razed in 1947, replaced by a brick apartment building, whose tenants soon began complaining of flickering lamps and damp walls despite no visible leaks. The superintendent recorded these maintenance requests without comment, but one note in his logbook stands out: light fails each May 15th, returns by dawn. It was the anniversary of Clara's recorded death. A retired nurse named Agnes Rowan, who had worked under Dr. Keene, moved into the building in 1951 and kept private journals describing nightly footsteps in the hallway. Outside her door, she believed they belonged to the bride who woke too soon. Rowan corresponded briefly with an anthropologist from Rutgers, studying cultural memory in small towns and how legends emerge from trauma. She compared the story to that of the Radium Girls, noting that both began with a glow of innocence mistaken for health. The professor later published a paper in 1953 citing the Montclair case as a psychological echo of industrial tragedies, but his references were so veiled that readers assumed it fiction. Still, county workers found reason to visit Greenwood again that winter, when ground frost caused a sinkhole near the Lytton vault. The crew reported an odor, not of decay but of damp metal. Photographs taken that day show a faint reflection on the stone lid, as if moisture carried its own light. The report was filed away, stamped resolved. By then, the cemetery had acquired a reputation among local police. Rookies sent to patrol the grounds often returned pale, claiming to hear murmurs through the fog that matched the cadence of breathing. In 1956, an archivist named Willard Hemsley attempted to compile a complete history of premature burial cases in the state. He described the Lytton file as a convergence of science undone by belief. Hemsley's typescript ends abruptly with a marginal note. Recheck mortuary license, Daniel Price. That page was never found again. Years later, his widow donated his papers to the county library, most brittle and half-burned along their edges. Yet one surviving scrap held a sketch of Greenwood's northern ridge shaded heavily in graphite with a single word beneath. Still, by the early 1960s, the northern ridge of Greenwood had become overgrown. The names on the stones softened by moss and soot. A caretaker, named Peter Lang, took over the property after Vale's death and began restoring the walkways for a small stipend from the diocese. He wrote in his maintenance diary that the air near the Lytton vault remained peculiarly heavy, as though the ground exhaled. Lang was a practical man, a veteran of 2 wars, but he was also meticulous about documentation. He measured temperatures, sketched the slope of graves, and kept carbon copies of every letter sent to the parish. One such letter, dated October 18, 1963, mentioned finding fragments of silk embedded in soil 30 feet from the vault, along with what he called a smooth oval of glass no larger than a thumbprint that glowed faintly even in shadow. The object was sent to Newark General, but disappeared before testing. The receipt remained, but the specimen line was crossed, out twice in blue ink. Lang's notes grew increasingly anxious over the next 3 years. He described hearing a woman's cough echoing between the trees during evening rounds and once glimpsed a white shape bending, as if to listen at the ground. When he mentioned it to the parish rector, Father Byrne, he was told, the past can listen, but it cannot answer. That remark appears again in Byrne's homily notes for All Souls' Day. 1965, the line was underlined twice. A year later, the church underwent renovation, and masons opening a foundation trench unearthed a small wooden box containing rusted scissors, a silver hairpin, and a folded scrap of linen embroidered with the initials. C.L. Lang's handwriting trembles in the margin beside the inventory. Returned to vault as found, the relics were sealed within a new reliquary under the chapel floor. The workers reported a faint warmth, radiating through their gloves even in the frost of December. By the 1970s, the cemetery had been declared historical property, though public access remained limited at night. During an interview with the Montclair Herald, Lang refused to speak on record about Greenwood, but said quietly, "It isn't the dead who linger, it's the mistaken. The article never printed his name, listing him only as the groundsman. Within months he resigned, moving south to live with his sister." His logbook ended with a final line written in smudged graphite, May 15th again, "The earth moved." After Lang's departure, Greenwood slipped once more into silence. For the next decade it existed as a forgotten tract of fenced woodland behind newly built houses, a fragment of older Montclair that residents avoided except for the occasional child who cut through on dares. In 1978, a surveyor marking property lines noticed that the compass needle wavered violently near the ridge. He recorded the irregularity in his log, but assumed magnetic interference from buried metal. When municipal workers dug test holes to install drainage pipe, they found the soil unusually dry, almost sterile, as if scorched from within. No insects, no worms. The town engineer sent samples to a laboratory in Princeton. The report returned inconclusive, but noted traces of zinc and barium, metals once used in early preservative compounds, reminiscent of those Daniel Price experimented with before disappearing. Parallel to this, the Montclair Historical Society mounted a small exhibition on local legends. One glass case displayed a photograph of the old Wetherell boarding house and a typed caption, "The Bride Who Slept Too Deeply, 1912. Attendance was modest until an anonymous donor contributed a sealed envelope containing a single photograph of Greenwood's North Ridge, taken in 1938, with faint white streaks rising from the soil. The curator dismissed it as a photographic defect, but one volunteer swore the streak resembled a woman's arm bent upward from beneath. Several nights later, vandals forced the cemetery gate and left candles burning along the path to the Lytton vault. the wax pooled into shapes resembling footprints. Constables recorded them before rain washed the marks. Away, a few residents living nearby reported the odor of damp lilies in their houses despite closed windows. The county council debated relocating all interments from that section, but legal costs halted the idea. By 1981, budget records show Greenwood listed as non-active burial site, maintenance minimal. Yet every few years on the anniversary of her recorded death, someone left a bouquet of white roses bound with black thread at the gate. No one ever claimed responsibility. The petals always wilted slower than natural, their color turning faintly yellow under moonlight, as if absorbing a hidden glow. By 1984, a graduate student named Ruth Halpin, studying folklore at Columbia University, began researching Greenwood's legends for her thesis. She visited Montclair repeatedly, interviewing elderly residents and church volunteers who still remembered fragments of the Lytton name. One of them, a woman in her 90s identified only as Mrs. Laird, recalled that her father had worked at the cemetery in the 1920s and came home one night pale as milk, saying the bride hadn't settled yet. Halpin recorded dozens of such recollections on tape, often filled with pauses and nervous laughter. When she submitted her preliminary paper, she referenced the Radium Girls as a historical parallel, young women whose radiance betrayed both vitality and decay, and suggested that Clara's body may have absorbed similar substances from Daniel, Price's experimental compound. She speculated that this contamination could explain the lingering warmth and phosphorescent soil. Her supervisor advised caution, fearing defamation, but the idea fascinated local journalists who had grown up hearing whispers of the vault. In 1985, an article titled "The Bride of Greenwood, Fact or Fever Dream" appeared in the Montclair Daily Ledger. The writer quoted Halpin anonymously and reproduced a blurred photograph of the ridge taken during her visit. The image showed a faint human outline beside a gravestone, though the negative had been damaged by moisture. The newspaper office received dozens of letters from readers claiming ancestral ties to the cemetery, each insisting the story be left alone. One, signed only a friend of Daniel, warned, "Some research ought not be reopened." Weeks later, Halpin's rented room was found undisturbed, except for a single index card on the desk reading, "Still breathing." Police concluded she had returned to New York, but her belongings remained unclaimed for months. The college quietly withdrew her name from public listings. Her thesis draft survived only in departmental archives, marked incomplete. That same winter, heavy snow collapsed part of Greenwood's north fence, exposing the ridge to passers-by. A postal worker cutting across at dusk reported seeing what he described as a woman standing by an open place in the ground, arms at her sides like she'd been waiting. When he called out, the figure turned and vanished behind the tombs before he could approach. His account was dismissed, though the following morning, a single footprint appeared in the frost where he claimed she'd stood, small and narrow, leading nowhere. By the early 1990s, Greenwood had become a site of uneasy curiosity. Among amateur historians and night photographers who sought evidence of the so-called bride's vault, most of their images showed nothing unusual, but several captured faint smudges of light curling near the soil, shapes that developed unevenly even on digital film. The town council ordered no trespassing signs installed after a group of teenagers staged a mock seance and accidentally set a small grass fire near the old church ruins. The blaze was contained, yet when firefighters raked through the ashes, they found an intact strip of lace preserved beneath the soot, its fibers dry and odorless. The piece was later dated by textile experts to roughly 1910, matching the era of Clara's wedding dress. That finding renewed debate among local archivists about how many artifacts had truly been removed from the vault in past decades. The Montclair Historical Society proposed an official excavation in partnership with Rutgers University, but insurance complications and church objections halted the plan. Brief notice in the Newark Evening Journal mentioned ecclesiastical reluctance rooted in family privacy. Though the Lyttons had no known descendants, a rumor spread that the diocese had sealed the original coroner's notes in its archive, fearing embarrassment if mishandled preservation methods were confirmed. During this same period, a documentary filmmaker named Stephen Corley requested access to Greenwood for a short film on forgotten tragedies. His footage, only 7 minutes, showed him walking the perimeter at dusk, describing the events of 1912 in measured tones. When he reached the ridge, his microphone captured an intermittent tapping unlike wind or insects. He joked it might be soil settling. Yet after the clip circulated locally, audio technicians who analyzed the waveform noted a consistent rhythm. 3 knocks, then pause, then 3 again, as if signaling. Code enthusiasts later compared it to a fragment of Morse for SOS. Corley dismissed the coincidence publicly, but stopped production. Afterward, in a letter to his editor, he wrote, "If there is explanation, it is human, but I am not the one to find it." The camera and tapes were donated to the county museum. Their exhibit label now reads simply, "Sound from Greenwood." Source undetermined. By 1999, the ridge had been fenced completely, the gate welded shut, but even from the street, locals swore that the interior glowed faintly some nights, like the afterimage of a candle just blown out, trembling in darkness yet refusing to fade. By the turn of the century, Greenwood stood behind rusted gates and leaning iron crosses. The northern ridge half hidden under ivy. A local preservation grant briefly revived interest in restoring the site. Volunteers cleared paths and catalogued remaining stones. A historian named Dr. Michael Avery supervised the effort, noting each inscription with quiet precision. When his team reached the Lytton vault, they discovered the marble nameplate had fractured cleanly across the middle, though. There were no signs of impact. Beneath the split, faint streaks of yellow-white residue lined the crack. Avery collected a scraping and sealed it in glass. Laboratory tests later described it as phosphorescent mineral of undetermined origin. During interviews, he explained that early 20th century embalming compounds sometimes left such traces, linking it to industrial contamination, in the same way scientists had once examined the Radium Girls tragedy. His measured tone did little to ease unease among volunteers. One quit the project after, reporting soft knocking from inside the vault. While she photographed the inscription, another claimed her camera, lens fogged only when pointed toward the ridge. Avery dismissed superstition, yet began locking the archive cabinet each evening. A journal entry found among his papers years later reads, "If warmth persists beneath stone in midwinter, explanation must be chemical, not spiritual." Still, he never submitted his final report. Instead, he mailed a brief letter to the county curator. Greenwood cannot be catalogued accurately. Its silence interferes with measurement. When heavy rain that spring flooded part of the cemetery, the ridge remained strangely dry, a phenomenon recorded by meteorologists as an anomaly in soil absorption tests. Newspapers mentioned it once, then ignored it. Locals returned to treating Greenwood as a sealed relic. Joggers cut wide paths around the outer fence, and delivery drivers refused to park along the adjoining lane. Some nights passing, cars reported a brief shimmer over the iron gate, as if headlights caught a veil in motion, yet no one stood there. Police responding to one such call found only fresh soil disturbed near the base of the old church wall, shaped as though someone had knelt there recently. The file closed without note. The record's final typed line read simply, "Site stable, atmosphere heavy." By 2008, Greenwood's name resurfaced in a local history podcast that explored New Jersey's forgotten medical mysteries. The host, an archivist named Ellen Stroud, devoted an episode to what she called the bride beneath the stone. Her research leaned heavily on surviving coroner's files and the laboratory notes from Dr. Avery. She explained to listeners that early 20th century embalming agents often contained barium carbonate and radium salts, and that miscalculated mixtures could induce suspended animation for hours, even days. Stroud mentioned Clara Lytton by name only once, preferring to describe her as a case lost between science and superstition. After the episode aired, the county archive received new correspondence, typed letters signed by descendants of the old Davenport's mortuary, family who insisted the vault should remain sealed. They claimed the last apprentice to work there. Before the 1930s collapse of the firm had spoken of breathing sounds from the crypt when the frost thawed each Spring Stroud planned a follow-up documentary but cancelled it after visiting the site herself. She noted privately that her audio recorder malfunctioned only while near the northern ridge and resumed normal function at the main road. The recording she recovered carried faint background tones resembling rhythmic taps, 3 quick, 3 slow, 3 quick, the same pattern that once appeared in Stephen Corley's film nearly 2 decades earlier. Audio specialists ruled it coincidence, yet Stroud ended her field notes with one understated line: source persistent, vault quiet but not still. In the same year, maintenance workers restoring storm drains along Greenwood's western edge unearthed remnants of old coffin wood, saturated with a crystalline residue. The chemical report described it as an oxidized luminous compound of organic origin, though the paper's margin bore a handwritten note from the analyst: sample emits glow at 2 a.m., dimmer by dawn. When questioned, the crew denied exaggeration but refused further excavation, saying their equipment failed repeatedly whenever the digging reached the soil of the ridge. The county surveyor replaced the section with reinforced concrete and advised no future interference. By late autumn, the cemetery closed again, padlocked by order of the Historical Commission, leaving behind a single wooden sign warning trespassers that the ground remained unstable. Those who lived nearby said the sign itself sometimes swayed, though no wind touched the trees surrounding it, moving in slow rhythmic intervals as if timed with the memory of breath. After the closure, Greenwood returned to rumor, existing mostly as a name whispered among teenagers and amateur historians. Someone spray-painted "Still Breathing" across the outer wall in 2011. It was removed within days, though the faint outline remained visible whenever frost settled. Journalists from the Newark Review attempted to trace the phrase's origin and discovered it had appeared repeatedly in old municipal complaints dating back nearly a century, scribbled in margins, typed between notes about flooding or maintenance requests, always the same 2 words. By 2013, the county considered repurposing part of the land for a memorial park, but ground stability reports showed unexplained air pockets below the ridge, irregular voids that refused to fill with water during testing. Geologists recorded the phenomenon, but could not identify a cause, suggesting ancient drainage tunnels. The proposal was abandoned, and the site was fenced once more. In the same year, a retired chemist named Arthur Lem, who had once corresponded with Dr. Michael Avery, published a short article in a private newsletter comparing the luminous traces found near the vault to residues from early T medical isotopes similar to those studied in the radium girls' cases. He argued that Clara's body, embalmed with experimental compounds, might have undergone a slow photochemical reaction, producing faint heat for decades. His explanation, though rational, unsettled readers more than the legend itself. It implied that the warmth and faint glow were physical evidence, not imagination. Lem visited Greenwood briefly that summer and described in his notebook the stillness of the ridge. No insects, no sound, only air thick like breath. The notebook was found among his papers after his death the following year. Its final line almost illegible, heard tapping again, fainter. When a new caretaker, John Peterson, assumed responsibility for the grounds in 2015, he reopened several drainage channels and reported that the soil near the Lytton Vault had fused into a clay-like crust. It's as if the ground baked itself, he told the township. Engineer Peterson quit 2 months later, without collecting his final pay. The next caretaker refused to go near the ridge after sunset, insisting the mist there never drifted naturally, but curled inward toward a single point, like breath returning to a mouth that no longer remembered air. By 2018, Greenwood's Ridge had become the focus of a small independent research project funded by a regional historical foundation. The lead investigator, Dr. Sylvia Horn, specialized in archival pathology and intended to cross-check old burial procedures. With chemical anomalies reported across northern cemeteries, she approached Greenwood with skepticism, but left her findings unfinished. Her notes, later found in a sealed envelope at the library, suggest she had recovered fragments of coffin wood embedded with crystalline dust that emitted low, continuous warmth when handled. Horne connected the phenomenon to radium-based compounds similar to those used by industrial suppliers in Newark around 1910, the same city tied to the Radium Girls tragedy. She mentioned Clara Litton by name, writing, "Her preservation may have been unintended alchemy." In one margin she added, "It glows only when silent." The sentence was never explained. Shortly afterward, Horne requested restricted access to diocesan archives, claiming she had located correspondence between Daniel Price and a mortuary chemical firm in Orange County. No such letters were found when officials later searched the same boxes. 3 months later, Horne resigned from her post and relocated overseas without public statement. The Foundation released a brief summary acknowledging the research but warning that further excavation risks structural collapse. Local reporters revisited the story under the headline, "The Bride Who Refused to Rest." They included a recent photograph of Greenwood showing the church ruins under a veil of mist, but when printed in the Sunday edition, the image appeared slightly altered. A faint outline stood near the ridge where no person had been visible on site. The photographer swore his lens was clean. His negatives were inspected. They were blank in that region, as though the emulsion had never developed. Horne's colleagues interpreted the effect as light leakage, yet technicians noted the surrounding frame remained intact. A subsequent editorial described Greenwood as a monument to unresolved chemistry and faith. The wording echoed an earlier article from 1919 that had first announced the rediscovery of Clara's disturbed coffin. The repetition unsettled older readers who still remembered fragments of that earlier scandal. By winter, the fence around the ridge had rusted through, and travelers cutting between neighborhoods began using the cemetery path again. Some said the air changed temperature abruptly upon entering, a warmth followed by deep chill, and that the silence seemed to pulse like a hidden heartbeat deep under the frozen ground. In 2020, the township commissioned a limited geophysical scan of Greenwood to verify ground stability for nearby construction. The radar equipment recorded a cluster of irregular cavities beneath the ridge, roughly 6 feet below surface, aligned in a spiral pattern unlike standard burial. Rose, the technician in charge, noted that the readings produced pulsing interference consistent with low-frequency vibration. The crew assumed malfunction until they repeated the scan months later, under different conditions, and observed identical interference, localized to the same coordinates. The data log described it as periodic displacement. When asked whether that meant movement, the technician replied only, "Something shifts." The report circulated quietly among council members and was later archived without release. During the same period, a local teacher leading students through Montclair's historical tour recounted the legend of Clara Litton outside the cemetery gate. Several students later claimed that as she mentioned Clara's name, the air grew warmer and their wristwatches stopped for a few seconds. Maintenance staff confirmed minor power fluctuations across nearby streetlights that afternoon. A city electrician dismissed coincidence, but recorded the event under the same timestamp. At night, security cameras placed to monitor trespassing, occasionally triggered without visible motion, each activation accompanied by a brief mist forming over the ridge, dispersing after exactly 30 seconds. One frame captured a shape resembling a standing woman in partial silhouette. The subsequent frame was empty. The incident, report filed by the security company, described possible lens artifact. Residents near the perimeter began reporting a faint metallic smell drifting through their windows at midnight on certain dates corresponding closely to the anniversary of the original burial. The pattern repeated in 2021 and again the following year, always between May 14th and 16. At those times, dogs refused to approach the gate, and small vibrations could be felt through the ground, like the hum of a passing train, though none were scheduled that late. Many who grew up with the story accepted it as local folklore, yet the persistence of measurable anomalies forced even skeptics to reconsider. The county archivist, reviewing old maintenance maps, wrote in his notes, "Pattern repeating with precision suggests natural rhythm, not haunting." Yet rhythm of what? By 2022, Greenwood was largely forgotten again. except by a small circle of researchers who treated it as an open geological curiosity. A graduate technician named Lena Whitcomb conducted an independent nighttime survey using thermal imaging. She expected uniform cold, but the camera revealed a distinct oval of higher temperature surrounding the Lytton Vault, roughly the outline of a human body, fading outward into the soil. The data persisted across multiple frames even after recalibration. Her field report, later published in a minor journal, concluded that subsurface thermic irregularity may stem from lingering chemical oxidation of embalming residues. Still, Whitcomb admitted privately in correspondence to a colleague that the temperature pulse seemed to rise and fall at regular intervals. Like breath drawn too slowly to be chance, the article drew modest attention, reviving comparisons to the Radium Girls cases that had once haunted Newark. The same industrial era when Daniel Price's experiments might have occurred. Mention of that factory reconnected the Lytton file to a tangible historical framework and temporarily restored credibility to what had long been dismissed as folklore. Montclair. Officials received inquiries from documentary networks, yet no permits were granted. The diocese maintained that the cemetery was consecrated ground and must remain untouched. Whitcomb's data devices were confiscated during a later site inspection, officially for safety violations, but she kept copies of the raw thermal frames. The final image in her sequence, timestamped 02:47 a.m., shows the ridge bathed in even grey, except for a pale silhouette standing beside the coffin's coordinates, head tilted slightly, one hand resting on empty soil. The shape was faint, yet anatomically precise enough to unsettle even skeptics. The journal declined to reproduce it, fearing accusations of fabrication, but the raw file circulated online briefly before removal. Users who viewed it claimed the figure's expression changed upon repeated viewing, subtle shifts around the mouth resembling the first intake of air. The file has not been verified since. Original copies are said to display a single frame of static just before the image fades, marked by a faint triple knock within the audio channel. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, identical to the signal first captured by Corley's film in 1991 and again by Ellen Stroud's recorder in 2008, a rhythm that persists across mediums, indifferent to decades. In early 2023, local historians attempted to consolidate every surviving document concerning Greenwood into a single digital archive. The effort revealed how fragmented the record had become: scattered logs, half-burned journals, and letters fading to near invisibility among clerical microfilm reels. One entry misfiled under Public Works correspondence described a resonant hum detectable by ground sensor arrays near the cemetery. First reported by telecommunications, contractors installing fiber cables along Cedar Avenue. They believed it interference from underground wiring until the equipment continued to register pulses long after power was cut. The engineers recorded amplitude variations, roughly matching a slow human heartbeat and, as one wrote in his margin note, pattern ceases when recorder moved 20 feet north. The county archivist compared this data to Whitcomb's thermal findings and noted alignment within centimeters. Both sources traced to the coordinates of the Lytton Vault. No one issued a formal statement, yet internal memoranda recommended sealing the northern path entirely. In late summer, an unmarked van arrived, and workers poured a thin layer of concrete over the ridge, describing it as reinforcement against erosion. No public notice appeared, but residents reported the odor of damp earth for days afterward. The last person to access the site before sealing was an environmental inspector named Carey Dunst, whose report, though brief, included a peculiar postscript: surface calm, subsurface motion uncertain. Her handheld meter recorded faint tremors, periodic and steady. Dunst later told a colleague the sensation reminded her of something asleep beneath heavy fabric. She resigned 2 weeks later, citing stress. The diocese announced that Greenwood would henceforth remain closed to research or visitation, declaring it permanently at rest. Yet in November, a maintenance truck passing the perimeter at dawn captured dashcam footage of what appeared to be steam rising from the sealed section despite temperatures below freezing. The vapor persisted for nearly a minute before dispersing into fog. leaving only darkened concrete, as if moisture had breathed through from below. The video was logged, then quietly deleted from municipal archives without comment. By early 2024, the new layer of concrete across Greenwood's ridge showed small fractures running in circular patterns, hairline at first, widening each month despite no recorded seismic activity. The Public Works Department attributed the damage to frost heave, yet thermal surveys revealed the ground beneath remained consistently warmer than air, temperature even during the coldest nights. A local physics lecturer who examined the data remarked that the heat distribution resembled a slow pulse moving outward from a central cavity. Maintenance. Crews filled the cracks repeatedly, but the fissures returned within weeks, each time following the same pattern, like veins traced by unseen pressure. In March, a resident walking her dog along Cedar Avenue captured a photo of the ridge at dawn. A thin fog hung above the ground, glowing faintly in the half-light. She said it looked as if the soil was breathing. When asked, she admitted she had whispered Clara's name without knowing why. That week, a temporary blackout struck nearby blocks. The only system failure recorded that season. Engineers discovered nothing wrong with the lines. The following month, an independent podcaster revisited the century-old case for an anniversary episode and played archival audio of the 1991 tapping pattern to illustrate the myth. Listeners later reported hearing the same rhythm echo faintly in the background of his recording, even when replayed on silent channels. The host deleted the upload, stating he didn't remember leaving the mic on. By summer, vegetation around the ridge began growing unevenly dark, green in tight circles fading to yellow toward the edge, forming what aerial photos described as a breath ring. The images drew minor online attention before being removed at the diocese's request. Parish statement released that autumn declared Greenwood stable and at peace, yet locals noted the air near the gate still smelled faintly of lilies each made a maintenance. Contractor later confessed privately that the scent seemed stronger whenever rain struck the sealed ridge, as though water met something warm beneath. A county archivist reviewing old correspondence wrote in his margin, "Pattern unchanged. Time constant. Nothing concludes." As the second winter of 2025 settled over Montclair, the ridge lay silent under frost. Its surface cracked but still sealed. The township no longer listed Greenwood among active sites, and the name of Clara Litton appeared only in scholarly footnotes about early 20th century medical misdiagnosis. Yet visitors continued to leave white roses at the rusted gate every May, always bound with black thread. No one claimed the custom. Some said the flowers appeared overnight, dew wet and already beginning to wilt. A librarian cataloguing the remaining archives found a page misfiled in the Essex County Register, typed in 1919, summarizing the coroner's re-examination. It ended with a line struck through twice in pencil, subject possibly revived prior to interment. She photocopied it, placed it in a plain envelope, and left it anonymously at the diocesan office where it vanished within days. By December, a reporter writing a retrospective on Montclair folklore revisited the site, describing the air as still warm at the center, colder toward the stones. When he asked an elderly neighbor why people still avoided the lane after dark, she answered simply, "Because she never meant to sleep." The phrase echoed older testimonies found throughout the record, the apprentice, the watchman, the caretakers, all describing a presence that resisted closure. And so the file ends as it began, a mixture of clerical caution and whispered belief. No evidence of haunting, no proven science, only the persistent suggestion that breath once drawn in error continues somewhere beneath the sealed ground. In every generation, someone measures the heat, hears the tapping, or feels the air move faintly across the marble edge. Then silence returns, heavy and calm, as if the earth itself is listening. It is said that when mist creeps over Greenwood and the church bell catches in the wind, a soft pattern can still be heard beneath the frost. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 again. 3 once more. The quiet reminder of a bride declared dead but never quite finished breathing.